Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Michelle Moyd. I'm in the history department here at MSU, and it's my real pleasure to be able to introduce and chair this panel. So we'll jump right into it since we are kind of halfway between where we were supposed to be and the other time that was announced. So I'll just get into it. Our first presenter will be Jacqueline Bethel Mugwe. She has a BA, MA, and PhD in history and specializes in women's and gender history in mid-20th century West Africa. Her book, Gender, Separatist Politics, and Embodied Nationalism in Cameroon, received the 2020 Francis Richardson Keller Sierra Prize, the 2021 Idu Snyder Prize, and the 2023 Honorable Mention, first runner-up, of the Pius Adesanmi Memorial Award for Excellence in African Writing. Mugwe was selected as one of 15 American women historians shaping understandings of Africa's historical past by Amaka magazine in 2022. Mugwe co-edits a book series on women and gender in Africa for the University of Wisconsin Press. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Oh, I was going to sit. I even took off my shoes and got comfortable. Okay, can I do it with shoes off? Oh, okay. Okay. I don't need them. Okay, all right. All right. Shoes off then. All right. I did want to start off by saying thank you to Professor Achebe and to the JWAH Planning Committee. And my second article ever came out with the JWA Journal. And I had to email Nwando and ask her, does Cameroon count as West Africa? And she said yes. And with her blessing, I consider myself a West Africanist. So let us begin. So one day in December 1954, Cameroonian Esther Tani looked up from her household chores and called her husband over. The Cameroon-born couple were now living in Lomé, the coastal capital of French Togoland, today Togo. The newly arrived Esther was amazed and excited by her new surroundings. The bustling markets, a beautiful oceanside view, and the new languages like French and Ewe that she heard every day. That day in December, Esther daydreamed about the new adventures their life beyond Cameroon would bring. With a playful smile, she asked her husband, David, quote, if he still believed that the dreams she used to have of them traveling to foreign lands were figments of her imagination, unquote. He could only give a guilty smile, remembering how Esther had shared these dreams with them when they previously lived in Victoria and the British Southern Cameroons, today modern Cameroon. But David had remarked, quote, that there was not the slightest chance of such a thing ever happening, unquote. And he would sigh, dismiss her and say, quote, you and your dreams. But there they were in Lomé, living a new life abroad. Esther's nighttime dreams having become real. The Tanis were in French Togoland to spread their newfound faith, the Baha'i religion. The small religion was founded in 19th century Iran, or Persia, and stresses racial, cultural, and gender equity. In 1950, the head of the faith, Persian Shoghi of Fendi, began modest and small plans to spread the faith in Africa. He sent those from the North of America, those who were British, those who were Persian, and those who were Indian, and were Baha'i believers to the continent to spread the faith, and an act of what Baha'is call, quote unquote, pioneering. Essentially, unpaid missionaries who relocate long-term to a new country to spread their new Baha'i religion. In Africa, the faith first found moderate success in Uganda in 1952, whereby the mid-1950s, there was around 900 believers in the country. In late 1953, a Ugandan man who was an early Baha'i convert traveled across Africa to spread the faith in West Central Africa. He began in Cameroon, where he met the Tanis and began to preach the faith to them. Based on their social power as leaders in their communities and the fact that they were the first couple to become Baha'i in the area, the Ugandan man dubbed them, quote, the Adam and Eve of the Baha'i faith in Cameroon, unquote. In the area, the faith also found small but moderate believers, with just around 1,700 converts by 1959. In 1954, Shoghi Effendi, the head of the faith, sent telegrams throughout Africa, sharing his plans to spread the faith globally, aiming specifically to focus on areas of the global south that had not heard the Baha'i message yet. This time, he specifically honed in on new local believers to be the ones to spread that message. So David and Esther Tani, a once very staunchly Protestant couple, volunteered to quote-unquote pioneer and spread the faith in their assigned locations throughout West Africa. They would spend over 30 years abroad spreading their religion in French Togoland and in the Gold Coast, today Ghana. Esther and David Tani's pursuit of spreading their newfound religion abroad is part of a larger transnational story that comprises my second book project that draws from over 2,000 handwritten letters, unpublished travel accounts written by those born in Africa, and those accounts were written throughout the 1950s, and many oral interviews in my country, Ghana, Nigeria. The book is now done and is provisionally titled Pan-African Lives, Racial Politics, and Belonging in Africa. So Pan-African Lives is a transnational history that examines the circulation of ideas and followers of a small religion across West Africa's national borders from the 1950s to the 1970s. I argue throughout the work that the Baha'i faith's emphasis on traveling for the faith and formal education, specifically, open spaces for social power and prominence by people of varied racial backgrounds and genders. The Baha'i faith challenges racial and gender inequality that is present or was present at this time in many dominant faiths, such as the Christian faith. In Africa in particular, the Baha'i faith provided an outlet for resistance against European control and offered the opportunity for social advancements regardless of race or one's gender. The faith's emphasis on travel, and that's an important part that I want to emphasize, and also their emphasis on formal education gave some African Baha'i women the opportunity to gain skills and knowledge for important roles in their homes and beyond. In the book, I illustrate how my subjects fostered Pan-Africanist and Afropolitan worldviews within their newfound faith, basically allowing them to pursue diverse ways to lead in their homes and also beyond, and promote racial and gender unity while shaping new ways of being African and belonging in the continent. The book unfolds across 7 chapters, and each chapter focuses on a specific Baha'i group of color. So one is on African American women, one on African women, another on Indians, and another on Persians. And I show across the broader themes how these issues of connection play out. And I link the end of each chapter through a shared geographic location, a shared event, and encounter, a dream. These chapters show snapshots of raw moments, everyday moments in Pan-African transnational lives. One chapter of the book, part of today's very short talk, shows how African Baha'i women use their unique responses to political making, and shaping Pan-African unity among diverse Black people, particularly women. It shows how their engagement in kinship politics and intellectual power nurture their Pan-Africanist dreams, leading to social power and prominence in their homes, religious circles, and communities. Though I reference varied women's stories, one of my major focuses is on Cameroonian Esther Tani, here, where you see her here, known by family and friends simply as Mama Tani. My emphasis is on her transnational lives, plural, showing how African-born Baha'i women fostered unique social, political, religious, and intellectual power while traversing West Africa in the mid-20th century. They undertook their journeys as quote-unquote pioneers, and Esther herself relocated abroad long-term. Such women shaped their views on gender and race, not only through their faith, but also through their everyday encounters and travels to various local cultural contexts. Throughout their journeys, African Baha'i women nurtured Pan-Africanist goals of racial belonging, women's power, and unity among, and I want to emphasize, diverse women of African descent. Sources reveal that Baha'i African women organized conferences, and they were very busy with this, for women across West Africa between the 1950s and the 1980s, bringing together diverse women from Africa, the US, the Caribbean islands, and the UK as well. Through such acts, African Baha'i women's vision of Pan-African women's unity was seen from vibrant dreams of being one and belonging to the continent. The dreams of these women, particularly of Esther Tani, inspired me to use a dream-based framework in my examination of these women's actions. In the dream, I particularly emphasize Esther Tani's nighttime dreams, 3 of her own and 1 from someone else, which show key moments in her life. The first, childhood; the second, marriage; the third, life abroad; and last but not least, death. Such a framework provides valuable insights into how these women wanted to unite and empower people of African descent, crossing varied borders and spaces. I do want to say that, there are ups to one's dreams where your aspirations come to life, and there are also disappointments. So everything wasn't always great. And so throughout the book, I reference particularly the concept of the health of belonging to emphasize the personal dimensions of these transnational lives in order to better analyze the ups and the downs. Esther, for instance, faced lots of physical issues, great anxiety, and a lot of her anxiety was stemmed to conflicts with her neighbors because she was a foreign person. She actually talked a lot about the fact that she would pass out and she would have all of these physical issues. And her husband wrote in their unpublished travel memoir that there were very hard times abroad. We suffered, he wrote, but Esther suffered the most. But despite these various problems, Esther Tani remained really determined to follow her dreams, boosting her self-esteem and self-confidence. And so what I want to do now with the remaining 4 minutes that I have is to emphasize one of her dreams. And that was a dream that, quote, they live in a foreign land where we knew no body. And this was a recurring dream that she had early on in her marriage. And she would tell her children and her husband time and time again, I keep having these dreams that we are living somewhere abroad and we're living somewhere new. And so by anchoring or focusing on this particular dream, I use it as a segue, as a gateway, particularly to emphasize her dream of African women's unity, particularly women of various African descent. And one of the ways in which Esther Tanya and other women did this was employing these varied kinship practices about maternal motherhood and power as a way to bring different women together at these various conferences throughout Anglophone and Francophone Africa as well. And I argued that they essentially employed what we call quote unquote feminist actions. I cannot say that they define themselves as feminists, but I say they're engaging in feminist actions because a lot of these conferences particularly focus on issues of gender equality between women and men. This is something they talk about time and time again. Women and men are equal at home, in the workplace, and beyond. They do not sugarcoat it, and they actually have plays that they will actually play out. So they will have a woman in the kitchen cleaning and so on, and they will ask them, well, what's wrong with this image? And people would say, well, I don't know. They're like, well, she's doing all of the work. The man is not there to be helping cooking and cleaning and so on. And so it was really fascinating how this all played out. And one conference which Esther Tanya played a key role in was planning the West Africa Baha'i Women's Conference in Liberia, which took place in 1978. There was over 200 people who attended. There was from over 16 countries, 150 of them, around that amount were women, and 50 of them were men. And so you had women from Grenada, neighboring West African countries, Black women who represented the UN who arrived, and I don't know if this pointer works here, but this is an image of it here. And Esther Tanya is somewhere up here in the front. This image is a little bit small. And so visual evidence from these Baha'i women's conferences affirms just how diverse the attendees could be. These images, these photos came from Black American women that I interviewed via Zoom. And they just send me everything that they had. If anyone knows anything about the Baha'i faith, they're a little bit like Mormons where they keep track of their history really well. So this project was different from my first one that I didn't have to struggle to look for sources. People would find out I was working this project and drop a massive amount of sources in my Dropbox, in my Google. And so I really struggled to hone in my project to West Africa. I could have done the entire continent, but I had access to over 5,000 handwritten letters between the 1950s and 1960s. So focusing on West Africa allowed me to focus specifically on 2,000 of those letters. Handwritten, by the way, not typed. So the collective efforts of these African Baha'i women to unite and foster spiritual sisterhood is a broader trend that we do see in African women's history. We've had lots of feminist scholars and scholars of African women's history here who have talked about women drawing from formal and also non-traditional sources of power to find innovative way to bring women together, particularly through the idea of motherhood and various forms of kinship. So by hosting conferences in West Central Africa and uniting diverse women in the area, women such as Esther Tanya sought to actively achieve their dreams of Pan-African unity and global harmony with Africa as the leader and at the core of these missions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And it's really nice to start off with a reflection on dreams and family and kinship and women. So thank you for that. Next, we have Dr. Bright Alozi. He is an assistant professor in the Black Studies Department at Portland State University. He is also affiliate faculty in the departments of History and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. He holds a PhD in history from West Virginia University. Dr. Alozi's core research interests focus on colonial and post-colonial Africa and the African diaspora, particularly social and political history, women and gender studies, petitions, and documentary sources, and then digital and oral histories, as well as protests and social movements. Dr. Olozi has published several articles in peer-reviewed journals and contributed chapters in edited volumes, and he also wanted me to let you know that his book, Petition Writing and Negotiations of Colonialism in Igbo Land, 1892 to 1960, African Voices in Ink, is out from Lexington Books. So I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Michelle. It's such an incredible honor to be a part of this event. I have amazing scholars whose works I've engaged with. So seeing you guys in person is a privilege. And thank you, Professor Chebe, for really inviting me. You've really followed my work and my progress, both as a grad student in the doctoral program and up till now. And especially thank you for making this event very family friendly for my research assistant. That is my 5-month-old son right here. Yeah. So my research covers silences, sexual violence, and the imperial politics of domination, uncovering silenced voices of female individuals in colonial southern Nigeria. I must state that it's a spin-off from my now published book. I thought it was too much to include in that book, especially because of the emotional trauma that I went through in this particular research. Also because I think there is something in it that could gravitate into a book project, because this, to the best of my knowledge, represents a very novel field in sexual violence in the colonial historiography of West Africa. I do not think there is any research, in-depth research in this subject matter as of now. And as I was working on over 2,000 petitions for my book, I came across this very damning part of the sources, and it was too painful for me. It took me a long time to develop this particular project. So I have reflected on these painful histories in yet another work, in which I engage with archival trauma, particularly these explicit cases of sexual violence. Please forgive me if some language here is crass, because I'm going to dig right into the archives. And so I might make references to the private parts, so please forgive that. That is as brutal as it can get in the archives. Perhaps I should start with an evidence, an incriminating evidence right here. On October 31, 1913, Mr. Akubuowanewu, he submitted a letter to the provincial commissioner of the Warri Central Province, which is in Southern Protectorate of Nigeria, over the ungentlemanly and grossly inappropriate conduct of Mr. W.E. Hunt, who was then the ADC, acting district commissioner place of the Oka district. He had alleged that Mr. Hunt, among other things, forcefully took advantage of his wife and assaulted her about 3 months into his wife being a cleaner. He wrote a 5-page petition, and I'm just giving you snippets of that petition. According to Mr. Wanewu's wife's report, which Mr. Wanewu reported in his petition, Mr. Hunt, who was reeking of alcohol, asked me, that is his wife, to undress before him. And when his wife refused, he proceeded to forcefully plunge at her while rubbing her breast and private parts. And it was only an act of divine intervention that his wife was able to run out of the bungalow while screaming and panting. Concluding his letter, Mr. Wanewu pleaded that the commissioner should bring the right charge against Mr. Hunt in accordance with the exhibits he presented, further stating that he saw no reason why he should not be punished for violation of the king's laws, his own wife, and the biblical laws of the 3rd, 6th, and 9th commandments of God. Well, like this example, the archives reveals many unsettling accounts of sexual violence and testimonies by female individuals of how they were raped, assaulted, and some even died in the process. Undoubtedly, we know about research in British rule in Africa. It's widely researched, including that of exploitation, including that of dismantling of indigenous structures and all that. But what is not often talked about is the profound and pervasive aspects of sexual violence in British Africa, particularly in British West Africa. It rarely receives attention. So the near absence of this history means that Voices like that of Mr. Nwanewu's wife are rarely heard in official accounts, let alone in published scholarly work. Here is where my work becomes very significant. And I hope that it will help us to rethink, narratives and scholarship around sexual violence, particularly in British West Africa. So what I'm going to do is not to rehash the colonial period or my subject area. It's a not too familiar area, right? What I'm going to do is to give you as it is, these raw instances of sexual violence in Nigeria. So I'm going to look at this overlooked issue of colonial rape and sexual violence and make these atrocities more visible in colonial historiography. I must say that in terms of my research, one challenge I found was that in digging through these thousands of sources, intentionally, sources relating to sexual violence, sexual assault and rape were hidden in miscellaneous folders, in mundane administrative work. I'm not kidding. For me to find one particular document, I had to forage days and weeks before I could find. But when I found one, that was my eureka moment. I was like, whoa, if there is one, then definitely there should be 2, 3, 4, or 100. Currently, I found 66. Imagine that. I have argued, so this is the contextualizing the problem within colonial historiography. When you talk about sexual violence, there is a lot of research on the East Central region of Africa and also so many in southern region of the continent. But when it comes to West Africa, really, to the best of my knowledge, again, nothing exists. And in agreement with Reuther's observation that scholarship on sex crimes in colonial West Africa to date has concentrated on official and popular anxieties about rape rather than the real-life experiences of girls and women in this trauma. In fact, in colonial historiography, they make it a native problem. That is the African problem. I found out that even in these narratives, official accounts, instances where there were sexual, misappropriations by indigenous Africans are more pushed in the narrative than those by British officers, on African women. As a result, I make the following arguments. I make the argument that, look, sexual violence is not coincident. It's not just happen. It was not incidental. It was a manifestation of colonial domination. Literally, the African woman's body was objectified, eroticized as an object to be conquered. And through several accounts, this is proved true. So British imperial domination was tied to sexual violence. And of course, for the many petitions that I used, which were hidden or hard to locate, it really demonstrates a broader colonial pattern of subjugated knowledge, where I took a cue from Mikhail Foucault's subjugated knowledge. So I'm trying to recover and introduce counter-historical narratives to recover these voices. So, let me just briefly dig into the sources themselves. One of the sources was Langston Hughes' diaries, where he documented his African encounter. And in one of his diaries, he witnessed a brutal scene where European sailors and merchants surrounded 2 teenage girls, probably around 10 to 15 years old, and brought them aboard the ship and gang raped them. This was very harrowing for me to even think about when I was, contemplating this particular autobiography and experience that Hughes witnessed. According to him, he described the girls as, quote, usually very young, small with bushy hair, and often hennaed nails. He said, and I quote, the boss grabbed one of the girls and took her off to his cabin. Someone threw the other girl down on the floor on a blanket in the middle of the sailor's quarters and stripped her of a flowered cloth. The girl lay there naked while, note, 30 men crowded around, mostly in their underwear, sat up on bunks to watch, smoked, yelled, and joked and waited for their turn to violate the little African girls on the floor. Hughes said that he was powerless in that situation and also admitted that this was not the first time this was happening. Such records are damning. But hey, look at the Foreign Office report that I also uncovered. April 18, 1898, a dispatch to the Foreign Office. The ACG described the misconduct of Mr. Crawford, who was a workshop engineer at the point, and he said that Mr. Crawford was in the habit of holding young men of the protectorate hostage and having carnal knowledge of them against their wishes. In fact, For Crawford, when these reports got to the Foreign Office, what was the recommendation? Whew, this event is really embarrassing low for the empire. Yeah, he was not punished. The protection of the empire was very, very paramount. In fact, this is even in the context of Mr. Crawford having the habit of spanking women in the buttocks, sometimes with their palms and at other times with a plank. The former action being for routine manly pleasure, while the latter action being to punish native women as they loved gazing at their tanned breasts and darkened buttocks. July 25, 1898. Again, a confidential dispatch to the Foreign Office. It was against Mr. Leon, whom the native claimed made women to take off their clothes so that they were completely naked for him to choose which one to spend the night with. That was inappropriate. And this was literally the response. He just said, send him back to England. No punitive, punishment was enacted. Well, in the interest of time, there's a record from the National Archives in London, where again, Judge Annesley, who was then the British consul in the Niger Coast Protectorate, literally raped a woman, Ekang. In fact, during that rape, Judge Annesley, held the woman, while others, his fellow officers, participated in raping this young woman. Now, particular to this petition I narrated earlier, what happened? Look at Mr. Hunt's reply. That he said, I acknowledge this, but I was drunk. Yeah, please forgive me. I was not with my senses. Now, see the provincial commissioner's actions. He said he should get his bags and leave the protectorate because his actions will smear the image of the British in Nigeria and would likely result in damage by riot by the people. There was again no punitive action, and he just set sail and left Nigeria at the point. Now the commissioner said, please keep this matter strictly confidential and out of public view, lest the people think bad of British sovereignty and morality. So whatever perceived morality there was. Despite repeated calls for punishment to be meted out, it was never done. Now, let me narrate some of the petitions from the National Archives in Nigeria. This is from Mrs. Arabweri, who recounted her experience that one day an officer made her lift her buba, that's a Nigerian attire, and slapped her buttocks very hard and many times while he smoked his pipe and watched him do cleaning work, even threatening that if you dare let this event get out, you'll be killed. What happened? Look at the response. This was an act of violation that she witnessed and said it was a disgraceful thing for me to lift my buba, so she felt so much shame. And she told the officer, I'm going to report you to my seniors. He laughed and said, which seniors? Nothing's going to happen. The only time that the officer felt a little bit withdrawn from this was when she now said, I'm going to report you to the gods of my land because they're going to exact retribution because this is a great sacrilege. And that was when she said, the officer withdrew and never spoke to her again. And she never spoke a word to the officer as well. But even then, Edith wrote petitions after petitions asking the governor to look into this and sanction the officer. What happened? Nothing. Look at yet another instance. Because oftentimes this was Justin and Kodo. This is very personal to me because during my research, sometimes I trace these the authors of these petitions. I trace this author Kodo to and discover that this was connected to my maternal home. The home of my mom. Yeah, maternal side, and my mom's family name is Wankodo or Nkodo. And I said, this sounds very familiar. So I traced it, and it was literally my mom's village. And I found the descendants of this particular petitioner. So, she rejected the advances of this officer, saying it was unthinkable for her to be his mistress. What happened? The officer violently raped her, calling her, quote, a black hag and prostitute. Oftentimes, these events led to rape. In 1942, a report I came across vaguely just mentioned that an unidentified woman died as a result of an unforeseen sexual encounter with Officer X. Do you see how intentional the name was struck out? This is how intentional the woman was not, looked into or justice brought about. So I interpreted this as yet another case of rape by a British officer, which led to the death of the victim. This one did not survive. Despite my extensive efforts, I searched and followed up, but I didn't see, the woman's identity or that of Officer X in the record. So I say, oh, okay, this another case of hidden efforts, and it suggests that this is a broader pattern of hiding knowledge about these events. Carefully erasing these histories so that they are not present in the archives. Lastly, I will end with this particular experience because it also shows the agency and resistance of these women. So this is, as much as it is a narrative of the sexual assault and rape, but also the power that these survivors exuded in resisting their oppressors. So Mrs. Chikodelewa Nkwovonicha recounted how she was repeatedly sexually assaulted by a district collector, Mr. Roland. She says, and I quote, "One day about the time of the tall shadow," that's about morning, that's how the Igbo people at the point count their times, when my husband had gone to work, Mr. Roland came alone to my home without his errand boy while I was peeling some cassava. Rather than asking for collections, he started touching my breasts and slapping my buttocks. I could see him bringing his penis out as he was arrogantly telling me how he owned me and would do with me as he pleased. Immediately, I reached for my husband's ofo, that's a symbol of justice among the Igbo, which was laying on the floor, and held it toward him and swore to him by Amadioha, the god of thunder, lightning, and justice, that he would die by lightning if he dared touch me as a married woman again. He seemed startled and frightened and quickly left me. I noticed his anger as he left. Knowing that he was furious that he could not have his way with me, I was afraid of my safety, so I ran from the house holding the ofo and shouting. Yeah, I've gotten the stop sign, but you see what this reflects, right? That really, this is part of that colonial, domination and control. It was sexual violence, rape, assault. They were a tactic of imperial domination and encapsulated the British colonial project. I'm really happy to engage further with this, and I thank you for listening. How do I stop it?
I don't know. Do you need? Okay, thank you, Dr. Olozi. Our next speaker is Dr. Kwame Edwin Otu, who is an associate professor in the African Studies program at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Otu is a cultural anthropologist with interests ranging from the politics of sexual, environmental, and technological citizenships, public health, to their intersections with shifting racial formations in neocolonial and neoliberal Africa and the African diaspora. Otu's first book monograph, Amphibious Subjects, Sasso and the Contested Politics of Queer Self-Making in Neoliberal Ghana, is part of the New Sexual World series edited by Marlon Bailey and Jeffrey McCune and is published by the University of California Press.
Thank you, Dr. Moyd. It's good to see you in person. And thank you very much, Dr. Achebe. I must admit that when I received your email to be a part of this conference, I was like, I'm not a historian, right? But then, so you made me do it. And quite frankly, I mean, of course, I really understand that this conference is being held under the auspices of the new directions in the field, and perhaps my invitation here is a reflection of the new directions in which we are going. And so I would like to thank you. You are, and I really would like to thank you for, I mean, because I'm very pleased to be here. And I must say that I regard myself in a way as a fugitive historian, because I have been flirting with historians for a very long time. And because I don't have a presentation, I'm going to actually reprise the title of my paper. It's Queer, the New Gender, ? Neoliberal Gender and LGBT plus Human Rights Activism in Neocolonial Ghana. In this presentation, I focus on how attempts to further criminalize non-heteronormative and gendered subjectivities and practices in Ghana, rehearsed particular historical projects that tethered gender and sexuality to heteronormativity. The emergence of the National Coalition for Proper Human, Sexual and Family Values, an anti-LGBT plus organization funded by conservative donors with ties to Western evangelical churches, is evidence of the terraforming tendencies of heterosexualization. It's Queer the New Gender illuminates how projects to civilize marriage in mid-20th century Ghana produced the context for gender mainstreaming, gender equality in the 80s and the 90s, which in turn anticipated the milieux in which queer now proliferates. I return to the moment of post-colonial state formation, the dawn of Ghana's independence from Great Britain, during which the newly independent nation embarked on a project to institutionalize heteromonogamy. In a bid to ascend into the ranks of colonial modernity, the government of Ghana, through a variety of state institutions and the Christian Council of Ghana, mobilized Victorian conceptions of marriage to consolidate heterosexuality. In amphibious subjects, Sasso and the contested politics of queer self-making in neoliberal Ghana, I interrogate how modernity making, and in fact liberalism, in the newly independent state relied heavily on the heterosexualization of sex and gender. Here, the tethering of Christian monogamy to heterosexuality produced the calculus that legitimized sexual and gender citizenships. A glimpse into the histories of heterosexualization in Ghana, this paper excavates how the formalization of heteromonogamy through Christian liberalism in the 60s anticipated the formalization of gender under neoliberalism towards the end of the 20th century and in the new millennium. I argue that liberalism, whether in its Christian or neoliberal guise, modified gender and sexuality without any modification to its core. Less than a decade after the departure of Great Britain and immediately following the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, Ghana embarked on its future-making project, seizing the nuclear family as the locus to jump into the future. This project ranged from calls to civilize marriage to the adoption of family planning through introducing knowledge of contraception to the country's populace, requiring a constellation of actors the desire to restructure family values and gendered unimagined affinities between Western organizations such as Christian Aid and Oxfam and the Christian Council of Ghana. The liaisons between these entities demonized polygamy, designating it as antithetical to Ghana's pursuit of modernity. The pathologization of polygamy as an uncivil, familial institution relied on the rhetoric that it heavily disadvantaged women, depriving them of access to resources and making them vulnerable to heteropatriarchal violence. In this discourse too, polygamy was deployed as a marker of difference, an institution that racially distinguished Africans from their European counterparts. And since monogamy was represented as civilized, sophisticated, and advanced, its benefits for Africans were overstated as expediting Africans' transition into the future. Arguably, these discourses were the terrain in which the seeds of heteromonogamy were sown, leading not only to the institutionalization of monogamy, but also the heterosexualization of marriage and citizenship in the post-colonial state. A litany of letters exchanged between the CCG and Christian Aid between the 60s and the 70s reveal the intent on the part of the post-colonial nation state to nationalize monogamy. In an attempt to make monogamy a Christian institution, the CCG, with aid from Christian Aid, created the Committee of Christian Marriage and Family Life in the early 60s. Also known as the National Committee of Christian Marriage and Family Life, the CCMF's main goal was to promote, quote, positive Christian teachings on sex, marriage, and family life. Through a series of conferences and symposia, the committee embarked on campaigns on youth-centered education on the necessity of family planning, offering Christian teachings on building a happy family. At one of their numerous conferences, one Reverend Boachi tells participants to be circumspect about the dangerous indigenous cultural practices that were invidious to their progress as modern citizens in the post-colonial state. In his exhortation to the youth, he declares his awareness of the challenges they confronted by intimating that they were wedged between the old and the new. The Reverend's suggestion to the old and the new was in reference to how customary values like polygamy, non-family planning methods, etc., hindered Ghana's vision to embrace Christian family values. The Reverend summons the youth to set themselves up for Christian marriage, articulated as a panacea to the paroxysms, the transition from the old to the new triggered. He goes on to declare that Christian marriage was that, and I quote, lifelong exclusive union and fellowship of one man with one woman, end of quote. Embracing this marital bond will not only help the youth overcome the uncertainty brought about by change, but also allow for Ghana's transition into modernity. The emphasis on Christian heteromonogamy as principle to contending with the transitions unfolding in the post-independent Guinean context is made palpable in a pamphlet encouraging Ghanaians to embrace Christian marriage and the nuclear family. Entitled, "Let Us Plan for Happy, Healthy Children," the pamphlet's frontispiece features an image of a man and a woman, arguably a married couple, and their children standing against the backdrop of a bungalow. The appearance of the nuclear family on the front page of the pamphlet summons Ghanaians to embrace this arrangement if they are to participate in and enjoy the fruits of Ghana's transition into modernity. Coordinating the pamphlet circulation were key figures like Miss Vivian Hazel, the National Secretary of the Christian Council and Marriage and Family Life. Correspondence exchanged between Miss Hazel and her British counterpart, the president of Christian Aid, Miss Janet Lacey, revealed the active roles played by Ghanaian women to executing these heteromonogamous pursuits. In one such correspondence, for instance, Ms. Hazel enclosed a copy of minutes from the CCMFL meetings and a report from the Synod of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, pamphlets published in English and several local Ghanaian languages on the Medical Advice Center, and information on the need for happy, healthy families. So as part of these projects, they were actually setting up family planning centers where Ghanaians would go to, Ghanaian women in particular, so they'll be educated on the necessity and usefulness of contraception, right? And of course, this is also happening in an era where we see this new Malthusian return to population control. So then this becomes really a part of the lexicon or the discourse being utilized at the time. These exchanges, I argue, do not only reflect the shifting terrains of sex and gender unfolding in the post-colonial context of Ghana. Indeed, they ideologically provided the threshing ground on which new ideas and projects about gender and sexuality bound to heterosexuality were both intendedly and unintendedly carried out. Beyond the 70s, there's an emphatic shift from Christian marriage and the nuclear family as antidotes to the insidious regime of polygamy, to gender equality, gender mainstreaming. The nuclear family, once presented as the arrangement that enabled women's empowerment by freeing them from the feudal patriarchal violence of polygamy, was now saddled with its own ilk of patriarchal violence. Here, domestic violence emerges as the new diagnostic vocabulary for the violence experienced by women and children in the nuclear family. During this period, Ghana is deeply also plunged into a crisis triggered by years of political instability and an unfolding global political economic crisis. Like many countries in the global south, the crisis in Ghana invited neoliberal interventions from organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. If the Christian liberalism of Christian Aid and Christian Council of Ghana employed Christian marriage and the nuclear family to free women from polygamy, neoliberalism, through these introductions of the World Bank and the IMF, reconceptualizes gender to free women from the domestic violence of the nuclear family and state-sponsored gendered violence. The women in development and gender and development approaches to development, I argue, index these shifts, provisioning gender mainstreaming as the antidote to violence against women. In Ghana, the establishment of organizations like the Women and Juvenile Unit, now known as the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit, and the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice epitomize this new representational reality. I am interested in how the emergence of these institutions exemplify, among other things, the movement from the heterosexualization of marriage to the heterosexualization of gender. Through gender mainstreaming projects, heterosexualization initiates a politics of gender difference, markedly different from gender politics in the global north during this period. In the neoliberal context, gender mainstreaming projects institutionalize gender by reducing it to women, and in the global north, the politicization of gender jettisons the heterosexualization of gender altogether. Neoliberalism in the global north readjusted gender by untethering it from heteronormative infrastructures. And in the global south, I argue that neoliberalism tethered gender to heterosexuality. Elsewhere, M. Jackie Alexander argues that both variants of neoliberalism structurally readjusted violence, thus inviting us to be skeptics of the neoliberal fiction that promises freedom. Overall, I'm interested in how the liberal discourse that constructed Christian marriage and the nuclear family as markers for modernity, because they were healthy for women, metamorphosed to become the neoliberal discourse that politicized gender in the spirit of women's liberation. That these discourses and the attendant politics reduced gender to women made it impossible for queer politics in the global south to articulate gender as a site of queer possibility. This fraught history, I maintain, haunts the contemporary context of Ghana's queer politics, which is currently animated by the neoliberal project that reduced gender to women. In this paper, my goal has been to reveal the ways in which contemporary neoliberal efforts to rescue sexual minorities in Ghana by engaging in LGBT plus visibility politics erase its complicity in creating the very homophobic context that it trages. In particular, I'm interested in how LGBT plus human rights organizations in Ghana rehearse the same roles played by institutions such as the CCMFL of the 60s and the 70s, and gender mainstreaming organizations of the neoliberal moment. And these organizations, I maintain, civilize queer, right, by sucking indigenous local iterations of queer self-making into the vortex of the global gay movement. To conclude, I ask that we be cautious of the recalibration of heterosexualization orchestrated through marriage, gender, and now queer by the infrastructures of Christian liberalism, developmental liberalism, and now queer liberalism. It is only by acknowledging the historical linkages that bind these projects, to echo the feminist Patricia McFadden, can we, and I quote, resist the hegemonic waves of colluding amnesia fomented by neoliberalism's marriage to neocolonialism in the now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Otu. Okay, so our next speaker will be our discussant, Dr. Saeed Adirento, who is Professor of History and African Diaspora Studies at Florida International University. He is the author of 3 books, so I'll just list his most recent one, Animality and Colonial Subjecthood in Africa, the Human and Non-Human Creatures of Nigeria. He's currently at work on a project called Fuji, the History of an African Popular Culture. and he is a recent winner of the Dan David Prize, which is the biggest prize in history in the world. Saeed.
Thanks for that great introduction. And of course, thanks, Dr. Achebe, for inviting me to be one of the editors of this great journal. When I was invited to be one of the editors, the great opportunity for me, despite the fact that I had a lot of obligations elsewhere, but it's just too difficult to say no to this great initiative. My response is going to be historical. In responding to the three papers, I would like to first do some brief introduction of the evolution of African scholarship on the issue of gender and sexuality and how these fields have changed over time. We know that from the 1970s, scholars of women and gender in Africa began to take the history of women very seriously. And I consider the work of Bolanle Awe, published around 1976, as one of the most important works in this direction, where she was challenging the homogenization of African women experience. And then these, to a large extent, paved the way for serious scholarship that seems to be interested in looking at history of women, especially political history of women. And what did we see? We began to see serious scholarship looking at the roles that women played in pre-colonial and colonial political history. And the whole idea is to say that women were part of these beautiful African histories. That was in the 70s and 80s. And of course, in the 80s, we began to see more of social history and of course, more of economic history that is further complicating what does it actually mean for women to be part of the bigger African history and African cultural experience. And of course, from the early 2000s, we begin also to see more disaggregation, serious disaggregation. What we need to understand is that as the history of women and gender evolves, what constitutes history, what constitutes sources, and what constitutes how to even think about women and gender history was at the center of this interpretation. So initially, again, we used to have narratives about the great African women who built empires like men. Later, we began to have scholarship that says, let's talk about women who were, prostitutes in the past. Then we see scholarship like Louise White's work on prostitution. And then someone like me came later to say, let's talk about it within the context of West Africa. So I see these papers as contributing to this long, beautiful, sophisticated history of women, gender, and sexuality in Africa. For example, Jackie's work, all what we've known all this while is about Pan-Africanism as an exclusive domain of men. It's very fascinating to hear and to actually listen to a presentation that placed women's experience at the center of a long history of Pan-Africanism, not even within the margins of appendages, but actually within a much more sophisticated, complex story. And that is why I think that's really very fascinating work, and I look forward to reading your book. And of course, the question of sexuality in Bright's work, I've worked on the history of sexuality. I wrote a book on the history of prostitution, heavily influenced, of course, by Louise White and other scholarship, but it's also fascinating to see a scholarship on sexual violence in West Africa. Much of the scholarship has come from Southern Africa, and much of them are based, of course, heavily on the question of race and racialization and security. Very fascinating. And of course, Kwame, meeting him for the first time, that I've known him forever. I think that's what digital culture makes us think. It was the issue of 15 years ago, Kwame Essien, a friend of mine, went to grad school together, wrote a paper on homosexuality in Ghana. That was 15 years ago. And that article was one of the first set of scholarship on the issue of gay and homosexuality. And so when I was talking to you yesterday, that was really fascinating about how the field has grown. And when we were writing that article 15 years ago, there was practically no secondary sources for us to depend. And now see where we are. Many thanks to scholars, and of course, many thanks to scholars who have taken the audacity to go into that very difficult issue. So the questions I have, one question I have for Jackie would be the question of, as we think through all this very fascinating history of women in Pan-Africanism, what do we understand within the context of class, even within this religion? I know it's heavily religion-based interpretation. So what do we get? And then, but that's actually not my most important question. I would really like to know the parameters for studying women and Pan-Africanism. You are not the first scholar to talk about women's migration for a very long time. Embedded in the history of African economic histories are women's histories of migration, trading. But of course, what you've done is actually to center it in a much more fascinating, sophisticated way in writing an entire book on it. So I think at this point in time, you have, and maybe you did it in your book, and I'm sorry if I'm just jumping, whatever. So, but the question is going to be, how do we study women's history of Pan-Africanism? You've already established for us that we should place them in the right perspective, but how do we do that? And Bright, of course, really interesting work again. What does the history of rape and sexual violence in West Africa tell us about other similar experiences in other parts of the continent? Of course, this seems like a conventional question we ask in any peer review, that given the fact that we see a lot of very beautiful scholarship from Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, what is new? We know that sexual violence is part of the repertoire, right? Part of the branding of colonial violence. And we know that already. So what is new? The other part is methodological and theoretical. Thanks, I'll get it. So the petitions you are using are written in English. What does it take to translate indigenous African languages to English? What do we gain? What do we lose? For me, the question of translation is not always the question of what did we lose. It's also what did we gain? Literally, linguistically, epistemologically. What consequences does translation have for us, especially a topic that is very sophisticated and, of course, very, very problematic? And the last but not the least, Kwame. Over the years, of course, first and foremost, again, I would like to say that I like the fact that you placed the question of LGBTQ politics within a very strong, interesting history of Ghana's nation. That's really fascinating historically, because when I and Kwame Essien did the work 15 years ago, we're in grad school and we're just trying to experiment with publishing. so whatever, I don't read stuff I wrote many years ago, again, the same piece. So, but I'm happy to see a scholar now placing it in the right historical context. I've always been interested in indigenous African cultural institutions' role in the long history of homosexuality in Africa. Because each time we talk about homosexuality, gay, LGBT, queer, politics of difference, politics of homophobia and everything, we always center so much about Christianity and Islam. And it does not necessarily mean that indigenous African institutions are not against, but what history do we, and the last but not least is it possible to understand the transformation that has happened since 2009? You and I know that what happened in 2008 was there's this big conference that was about to happen in Ghana, and that event is what is responsible for the scholarship that we have on queer scholarship in Ghana today. So it would be nice to see exactly what has happened since that particular conference that caused a lot of trouble, that paved the way for the article I wrote with Kwame Essien, and what does it really mean in terms of LGBTQ mobilization and politics. Thanks.
Dr. Achebe, how long do we have?
20 minutes.
Okay. So 3:10 till 3:10.
Yeah, let's do 20.
Okay. So do any of the panelists want to respond to Dr. Adirinto's questions, provocations? Okay.
Thank you so much, Zahid, for your great questions. I highly respect your work, and so a lot of your work on gender has influenced and shaped my own work. The parameters of discussing Pan-Africanism, I'll keep this short. When I first wrote a draft of the book, I sought senior scholars to read it, and the first issue they had was me using Pan-Africanism. And so, which is why on my chapters on African women and my chapters on African men, I say Pan-Africanist sensibilities and worldviews, because what they're doing is they are selectively choosing Pan-Africanist ideas that fall in line with their Baha'i worldviews about unity and gender equity. And there's limitations to specifically using Pan-Africanism, because what a lot of the people that I'm looking at, they are looking at, let's say, Persians who are coming to Africa, who were born there and living for a long time. They're seeing them as fellow Africans. And so they're sort of crossing the sort of racial boundaries and line in which Pan-Africanism actually restricts me in that larger analysis. But the difficulty is then I now have two other chapters, one focused on Black American women and one focused on Black American men who come to Africa with strong Pan-Africanist, sort of Pan-Africanism world views. And so I've had to sort of grapple with that and sort of balance that out, because their objectives are slightly different. Those who are Black Americans are coming under the racial amity sort of policies and laws that are happening in the US. And Africans that I'm interviewing, they say, we know nothing about this racial amity project that you're talking about. But I'm like, but that's the heart of the Baha'i faith. They have no clue. They're concerned about other things. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dorrington. These are thought-provoking questions, and I appreciate how well you appreciate this emerging field of research on sexual violence. Regarding your questions, what does the history of rape and sexual violence in West Africa tell us, in the context of the broader histories in other regions of Africa? Well, apart from the fact that this is quite a novel field of research for West Africa, because when we talk about East Africa, Southern Africa, there's like a plethora of materials, and research on that. But beyond that, I'm also trying to also locate agency and resistance, because oftentimes, even in these histories of sexual violence in other regions, we rarely hear about resistance, and agency in the context of these either victims or survivors, like the one I narrated about the woman who used the madi on her, or the offer. And there was even yet another instance of one survivor who literally slapped a colonial officer. Yeah, and she said she was trying to get away from him. But in that act, she literally resisted. By that act, she said, "Oh, look, you can't get away with what you want to do with me." So I think this is a research that also really helps us to reconceptualize colonialism, and relations, colonial relations during this period, even though it is from that painful perspective. And we're talking about methodology, what does it take to translate indigenous African languages in English? What do we gain? What do we lose? This is a very important question, and I believe also, at the heart of my book, chapter 3 talks about from orality to voices and ink, textual analysis of petitions. I acknowledge that one of the limitations of sources like this is that in translating some of these sources, we oftentimes lose, some of the indigeneity. For instance, there were amenaces, professional petition writers who wrote petitions for these persons, so something must really be lost. But I also read against or along the archival grain, and I corroborate sources. In one instance, I literally had to trace that petition, trace the family. And I realized that the family, they've passed on that history to the family, literally. And importantly, just to end, it is very fascinating aspect of my research. I never thought that in analyzing these petitions, I would find petitions written in vernacular Igbo language. It was an act of resistance. In fact, I have a paper where I am, recontextualizing these petitions, those written in vernacular language. Why did they write in vernacular? In some petitions here, the women will use Igbo phrases or outrightly write in vernacular, even when they knew it was going to be rejected. In Press's report, they say, "Oh, rewrite." And they'll go and rewrite in English. So I was like, okay, let me look at the vernacular and look at the English. So, but really, it's also a new aspect of the research that evolved from my study. But thank you really well.
I'll just, am I okay? Professor Adrian, thank you very much for your questions. And I think I'll just reflect or dwell on the indigenous cultural institutions, and like, maybe I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but like, were you alluding to homophobia indigenously? What was it? The allusion to homophobia within indigenous cultural practices?
Essentially, what are the elements of? Oh, sorry. Okay, good. So, I mean, the point is that most of the narratives, theoretical, have always been built around Christian Pentecostal perspective. And then, in indigenous Ghanaian cultural institutions, religious institutions, what is their take? Because the reason this is important is because, I don't want to begin to talk about West Nigerian Yoruba cultural, much more complicated thing, but I don't want to seem as if I'm trying to. So what are scholars saying about the perspectives of indigenous religious institutions beyond the Pentecostal communities leading this so-called Africanness of queer identity?
So I think that's a very, very good question, because it depends on how people perceive queer, right? Because I think that there's often the obsession with, let's say, the queer sex, right? But within indigenous institutions, there are actually formations that may not intentionally participate in queer sex, but have queer forms, right? So for example, you have like a fetish priest whose gender, who is cross-gendered or embodies, as like biological male embodying this female gender, right? But they may not be queer in terms of them having a desire to have queer sex. So I think these kinds of there's a way in which we reduce this conversation to just the queer sex, and I think that is what we don't want to talk about. That there are other formations, indigenous cultural formations that embrace queerness, right? But then maybe they don't even call it queer. But then there are certain, modalities that they exude that is clearly anti-normative, that is clearly against what the Christian religious organizations say, or the nation state. But because, of course, they are working within this, infrastructure of coloniality, which is still predicated on pathologizing indigenous institutions, perhaps there is something that wants them to remove themselves from anything queer because of queer's reduction to sexuality, which is the problem of LGBT human rights movement, because, and that leads to your next question, that I think after that conference in 2006, right, there is this constellation of gender and sexuality. I mean, Ghanaians are very, homosocial, right? And so one of the things this conference does is that we see a paradigmatic shift in understandings of homosexuality to homosexuality. So then, for example, you'll be walking on the University of Ghana campus, two men holding hands. It's something we used to do, friends hold friends' hands, right? But now, you'll be called gay, right? So my point is that there's been a massive, the ways in which queerness is construed, this obsession with it as a sexual thing, right, is really the elephant in the room. And so I guess this is my way of saying that the indigenous cultural leaders, they are afraid to acquiesce to this new iteration of queer, because for them, what is queer is not just about the sex, it's about so many other things, right, for which queer comes into homogenize or arrest as just related to identity, when it's beyond identity.
Okay, I think we have time for questions, so I'll collect 3, maybe 4. Here first. Oh, sorry. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you to all 3 panelists. Those were fascinating presentations. I have questions about sources for Jackie and for Bright. Medina Cham, teach African history at NYU. So question about sources. Jackie, I loved, I guess the Pan-African, I would argue alongside, actually, I would agree with you that the trajectories and the discussions that they're having is a history of Pan-Africanism that we haven't quite been exposed to. I was curious about the conferences, because it reminded me a lot of the 1959 West African Women's Union's conference in Bamako, where you also have a very large gathering of women speaking of the Pan-African future that they're trying to build. What is the materiality of the sources you have? Do you have transcripts of what goes on in the conferences? Do you have audio recordings? And I was curious about the kind of conflicts also and disagreements that you see emerging in those conferences, because these conflicts being exploited is what ended up killing, for example, the women's movement in Mali. And so I'm curious of what conflicts you see emerging. And to Bright, also a question about sources and the very difficult, sources and writing that you showed to us today. Made me think about, so Saidia Hartman asked this question in one of her essays about how does one revisit the scene of subjection without replicating the grammar of violence? And I was curious in your writing for this next project, how you're going to handle that tension of it's very important to discuss these histories, I agree, and it's a very important project, but of not reenacting that violence, I suppose, again. How do you handle that in your writing and how you present these sources to us? Thank you very much.
So maybe, well, I saw Harry and Nana, so maybe the second round. Okay, all right. I've been.
Okay, Greg Richard Kobe, okay, for Department of History, Michigan State University. My question goes to my brother, Dr. Bright. When I saw the title of your book some months ago, so as a person that is so much interested in agency, so I was thinking it should, but I'm happy to hear that it's not, that it should talk about, trying to negotiate, coloniality and all that. Now, my question is this: when, in the course of your research, because myself, whenever I'm in the archives, I see some of these colonial documents and I see the power dynamics there. And one of the things that keeps, recurring to my mind is, these guys are actually using, colonial machineries and, all these structures to actually talk back to these persons, So my question is this: to what extent do you see some of their action? My definition or my understanding of agency here is not just merely as an act of resistance to colonial rule, but then as a way of living colonial life and also trying to center themselves in the whole process of colonial making. So how do you see agency play out in this?
Thank you. My name is Harry Odampting. I'm one of the editors of the journal. My question, I have two questions for Jacqueline and for Bright. My first question, sorry, I missed the early part of your presentation on the Pan-African part, so I am going to read the book because I obviously work on Pan-Africanism, but when you're away at the conference, your children want to test your spouse. So I had to go take care of some situations. But my question is actually more on the religious side, which is about interpretation of dreams. And whether what modality, what religious tradition you're using to interpret these dreams, right? How are they understanding, what modality are they using? Is it their Christian background? Is it the Baha'i background? Is it their traditional African background, in terms of how these various modalities see symbols in the various dreams? And still on symbolism, I wanted to ask Bright about the Ofo. I don't think it's happenstance that the Ofo was lying down on the ground. For me, it indicates that this was an attempt to preempt something that had happened before. Secondly, how do you broach, in terms of research methodology, how do you broach this very difficult research with your interview, like descendants of people who suffered some of these rapes and so forth? How do you go about doing that? Thank you.
And then I think Nana will take this last one, and we may have to move on to break after that.
This is then for Kwame. So I had a comment and then a question. As you're talking about the building of a Ghanaian nuclear family, if you haven't yet checked it out, the Ghanaian newspapers in the 60s, the ads are of a nuclear modern family. And so that can be great source material to build. My question, I was just reading Hilda Bernstein, a Jewish South African, writing about the apartheid and how apartheid destroys families, particularly nuclear families, because of migrant labor. And so one of the questions I have about the creation of the nuclear family as a Christian family was two groups of people in Ghana. One is northern migrants down south. How is the state reconciling that familial group? The second is one which you write about a bit in your book, and then I'm writing about a different chapter, is fishing communities and how men and women that are married live separately, women live together. So how is the state also dealing with that form of marriage in this structure of a Christian ideal? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Medina, thank you for your question. Sources were transcripts, interviews, and Baha'is. They had this magazine that's no longer around between the 1950s and 1980s, in which they recorded all the events that were happening and what people were saying. And then particularly Black Americans that I interviewed actually had recordings, tapes. And then with the help of a whole crew of people, I had them transcribed. And so that's where many of my sources came from. This is very different from my first book project in that I was overwhelmed by sources. I was just drowning. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be bragging, but I just literally, I was like, stop, please stop, you know? And so I'll talk about the limitations. Okay, here is where I found limitations. When I was asking for these travel accounts and narratives, they were coming via Dropbox. People were flying in, handing them to me, and some of the pages were redacted. And I asked, okay, we go from page this to there are some pages missing. Or I would be in the archives in Chicago, and whole pages would be missing. And so off the record, probably shouldn't share, would ask and find different ways of figuring out why are these things missing. And so with the chief archivist in Chicago, he told me, listen, off the record, those pages are missing because it puts the person in a bad, immoral light. And then I would say, well, you know, you don't have to confirm, but is it X, Y, Z? Because I'd have my suspicion. Baha'is cannot drink. They can't do drugs. They all live over 100. And so some of the stuff that I found, it seemed like some of the people had relapsed and were drinking. So I would say, well, you know, am I on the right path? Did he go back to drinking? And he's like, well, can't deny, but can't confirm. And so that's kind of what I would do. And then with the travel narratives, they were coming from prominent Baha'is and from their children. So they would rip out the pages and I would ask, but where are these pages? And they would say, it's all there. I'm like, where are these pages? And so I would have different ways of trying to ask. One of the biggest issues that I had was a lot of the African Baha'i pioneers, their social mobility dramatically increases when they travel abroad because they're supposed to be unpaid missionaries, but they're being supported by the Baha'i administrative structure in the US. And they're supposed to be given money only for a month or two, but they would stoke empathy and say, I'm struggling here in Lomé, I need more money. They say, how much money do you need? So I would be sitting there translating the amount of money they were getting in US terms, and it's thousands of dollars in today's money. And I wanted to know, where did that money go if they're struggling? And I couldn't find the answer I started this project before my first book project for almost a decade. So finally I decided to talk to my research assistant in Cameroon, and I laid it out in a particular way. I said, well, you know, as Africans, you know, when you get money, you got to share it with family. I mean, did so-and-so kind of do something like that? And so I found out that many of the pages that were missing were talking about them taking the money and sharing that with family members, paying for school, paying for that, which you weren't supposed to do. And people were going to school, opening up business, and so on and so on. And so those are some of the issues that I had in terms of access. Harry, great question about dreams. These are coming from local tradition and consciousness. context of dreams. So Esther and a lot of the Baha'is, African Baha'is that I look at, are having dreams before they become Baha'i. And so it's all from the cultural context. But the thing about Baha'ism is that dreams are okay. Visions, prophets, that is more than okay. And so you have lots of Baha'is from Iran who are writing about dreams being okay, and so on. And so it sort of fits into that and also aligns with that. So everybody's dreaming. But there are some people whose dreams seem to be more powerful, and Esther was the one that would, she couldn't read or write, but she could recount for you whole books and dreams, and people would say that definitely would happen whenever she would dream something. Yeah.
Thank you so much, friends. Medina, really fascinating question. How does one revisit this traumatic research, without replicating the grammar or rhetoric of violence? So how did I, or am I going to handle this and present my sources without reenacting that kind of violence? So when I started this presentation, I shared another research I did, A House of Joy and Trauma, Life in the Archives and Personal Reflections of an Africana Historian, where I personally reflected on how I handle this, frankly, unenviable pain and trauma and anguish that I experienced when I plow through the archival evidence. But one of the ways I mitigate this is to not just present sexual violence as it is. I read beyond sexual violence to identify resistance, power, cultural agency, such that I am not just reenacting such kind of violence. If you're my paper ended with that experience of Mrs. Swankwo, who used the four, Madioha and all of that. And allow me to just read 2 lines from my ending. I said I ended this article with these accounts for several reasons. First, beyond giving us that narrative of sexual violence, it helps us to understand that African women were not passive victims at all. So that is a history of agency right there. It showed remarkable agency as well. And for me personally, and for readers, I wanted this to be narrative closure. I was looking for closure in the archives. I said, look, there has to be one person that resisted. I want to find it. I kept on digging and digging and digging. And I said, as I uncovered these hidden testimonies, I knew right there at the archives, when I found this particular document, that whatever work came out of this research, I would end with these 2 powerful testimonies. Because for me, it went beyond violence to say, look, there are those who resisted. There are these ones who said, look, we're not just victims, we're not just objects. I'm going to hit you. And, whether I get away with it, it's powerful. So that way, it's just how I kind of navigate that, Then on agency and negotiations, Greg, thank you so much for, thinking beyond agency, thinking beyond resistance, please, as the sole reflector of agency. For my research, both in my book and currently in this spin-off research, I also read agency beyond resistance. In fact, in many petitions, they're usually, before they address the main concern, it's prefixed most times by the cultural and everyday morals of the people. In fact, for these ones that relate to the painful histories of sexual violence, you see petitioners say, look, I'm writing this because as an African woman, this is how I live my life. As an African woman, I am married. Let me give you, sir, some context on how we live our lives as African women. So it's began to let me know that, look, beyond reading sexual violence in these archival materials, there's also a lesson to be learned about the everyday lives of these women. And I try to tease these nuances as I engage with the experiences. So I not only go through that colonial agency and negotiations, but really I look at what these petitions tell us about day-to-day living. In fact, in chapter 3 of my book, I consider petitions as some kind of autobiography of sorts, because that's what they show us, And lastly, Harry, thank you as well for thinking through some of the other subtle nuances like the offer. True, the offer was not lying there carelessly. And that's again how I look at a cultural agency. This woman had been repeatedly sexually harassed. She had related this to her husband. So, and of course, that the offer has it's very powerful when wielded by men. And she would narrate further that her husband would tell her to hold on to the offer. that is her protection. Whether that magic worked and that guy, I argue that I can't ascertain whether it's the presence of that offer, that religious reverence that made him leave the woman, or the fact that the woman found a new strength in these cultural artifacts. But whatever it is, that's yet another history of cultural agency, as much as it is of resistance. And in terms of my methodology, how do I broach this research as a painful one in terms of oral interviews with descendants of these individuals? I thought about that severally in my research. But one thing that gave me confidence and strength is that just before my grandmother passed, and for context, my grandmother had her sister who participated in 1929 Aba Women's War. Yeah, I'm so proud that I can look back at this history and locate my own family within that. But just before she passed, I was privileged to interview her. Her experiences and her petitions were also part of my book project. But one question she asked was this: when are you guys going to talk about the sexual exploitation and assault that we experience? So I realized that really, even though survivors are, most of them are no longer living, some actually want to talk about it, but they had no platform to. So, and I found kind of, courage to now start digging into, let me look at families of these people, their descendants. Were there any stories handed over to them? Do you know what I realized? Yes, they were talking about it. In some way, I believe they wanted these stories to be told. But as I approached it, I tell them this: look, what I'm doing is not to rehash this or make you remember this painful experience. I want to give us a voice to say, look, that voice we did not have then could be visible here. So hopefully I would achieve that goal, in my broader analytical thread of scholarship. But so far, that's what I found. Thank you so much.
So I'll be quick. No, thank you for your question. So northern migrants to southern Ghana, generally we tend to be very endogamous, right? So there's a lot of endogamy, that's marriage within the same ethnic group. And I think that they bring these cultural trends around marriage with them, from when they actually leave northern Ghana to the south, right? And so if they are actually, and they're also Muslim for the most part, right? So I think all these cultural forces as well, all these cultural historical forces, right, shape the kinds of endogamous, interactions or transactions that unfold in the South. And, to answer your second question, the fishing community, the Gans historically and maybe still, right, perceived as engaging in dual local postmarital residence, right? And I remember, so Shirley Graham Du Bois, who became the director of Ghana Television in the 1960s, started to do all these programs that focused on women in Ghana. And I think in that particular, she actually capitalized on being the director to also articulate a competing vision of marriage and the nuclear family, which was very different from the ones that were being pursued by the Christian Council of Ghana and the Christian Aid. And her version of, in her vision or version of this idea of nuclear marriage, she's actually encouraging Ghanaian women to engage in traditional forms of marriage, not Christian marriage, because Christian marriage made it very tough for them to divorce from their husbands. Right? So what I'm trying to say is that even in this particular context, within Du Bois's vision, right, there is still this emphasis on nuclear family, heterosexualization, that despite it being radical in a way because it's giving women the opportunity to engage in indigenous marriage and not Christian marriage because of how Christian marriage stifled women from being able to exit violent marriages or marriages they no longer found palatable, right? So the archive is really quite replete with these evidences, and I find them to be fascinating. But what is fascinating to me is that even if the tropes or the visions that are being articulated are in opposition to each other, that they still reproduce gender in heteronormative terms, right? So Du Bois's gender is different from the gender being articulated. Du Bois's nuclear family, it might be different from the nuclear family being articulated under the auspices of the Christian Council of Ghana and Christian Aid, but then they reproduce gender by tethering it to man and woman. Right.
Okay, so it turns out that we do have more time. So are there more questions? Okay. So here and then Tama in the back. Oh, either way, we can collect a couple. So yeah.
Okay, I'll say mine. I thank you for these papers and for the really good discussion. And I really appreciate you looking at Pan-Africanism through a feminist lens. I think that it lends something to how we traditionally think about the political, Pan-Africanism as a political and as a national ideology. And I think there's something that else to be learned from the relational element and there's other components of Pan-Africanism that I think, I think there's some things around sustainability that might come to bear on your research. One of the things I just wanted to ask is, I was really intrigued by the idea of it being tied to Baha'ism and women's agency and movement through a religious connection as being a part of a formal religion, these formal religions, and kind of what agency comes out of that historically. And I think that's really interesting to tie those two things together. And I just want maybe if you could comment on that. And then I think that there's, I'm sorry, I should have my program so I had everybody's name, but I'm struggling with I think the research around sexual violence and kind of how women responded is really important to look at that in the colonial period. But I'm also struggling with the idea of resistance or looking at agency and resistance as being what we're looking for, because sexual violence is so incredibly complicated that and I think this goes for any kind of time when someone is a victim, that how they respond, what it means. I think there's something to tease out more complicated. There's more nuance to what it means to be a victim and how one responds and what that means. I don't think it's always what we see as what we think of as resistance as being powerful. There may be power in other ways because of coming out alive and surviving and having surviving children to tell about it or family members. So I just think that there's some other ways of us thinking about that it's really complex, as others in the room have raised. And I think that there's some really important things that can come out of that, just kind of stretching that and going deeper. But thank you very much.
Tamer.
Hello, I'm Ethan Newman. I'm just an undergraduate student here at MSU. The question's a bit simpler. It's for Dr. Alozi. So you mentioned during one of your sources you used was Langston Hughes. I'm just wondering, is that the same Langston Hughes as the Harlem, the famous Harlem Renaissance writer? And was this, if so, was that before, during, or after like the prime of the Harlem Renaissance? And what impact did his travel over there have on the Renaissance, or vice versa?
Any other questions for this round?
If I might add one as the mic man, since I got the mic. So Bernie Moore, MSU and Alma College. My question is for Dr. Mugwe. I think this was such a beautiful presentation. And I mean, it was glamorous and informative, and I utterly loved it. My question, though, is related to the Baha'i question and Pan-Africanism. Because the Baha'i faith is such a centralized faith, where even central religious documents are not necessarily made public to believers in the faith. And there's such an emphasis on universal governance. how did these women articulate Pan-Africanism within that framework? And how did like the Universal House of Justice respond to such claims? And I think your very last sentence kind of hints at this, but can you talk more, please? I really liked the presentation. Thank you.
All right. I don't see any other hands, so hand it over to the panelists.
Thank you. I think I'll start with the last question. Okay, so let's be honest here. Number one, so I'm going to combine your question with Tamara's question. We're asking about this connection between agency, religion, and the Baha'i faith. I quickly realized once I was doing oral interviews in Cameroon and in Ghana that the people that I was looking at, their Baha'i communities were really small. And the majority of the people that were part of the Baha'i community, 99% of them were not formally Baha'i. They are quote unquote what they call friends of the Baha'i faith. Like, I mean, they keep saying I'm also one. And so it's basically if you agree with, you know, racial equality, gender equity, they have literally a category called friends of the Baha'i faith. So the sources all talk about friends, friends, friends. So it took me a while to realize, oh, it's really literally a category of friends. And so some of the women that I was interviewing in Ghana were prominent Baha'is, and they would have these large Baha'i events, and they would tell me, no one here is a Baha'i but me. And that people were attracted to the opportunities, the access to formal education, to the idea about racial equity. And they were attracted to that idea, and that even Baha'is themselves say in the sources that the majority of these communities were not actually formally Baha'i. They were friends of the faith. Now, when it comes to universal governance and all of that, scholars of Baha'i history are very clear that, you know, when it came to what was going on the continent, Africans were leading the way. And so sometimes they were doing the things that the universal governance and the higher institution did not agree with. But they would say, but this person's really important to spreading the faith. And they're also really clear in their tenet that each person has their own agency in how they feel and understand the faith, how they spread the faith. And so whenever I would interview people, they would say, are you Baha'i? I'm like, no, I like wine. They're like, okay, you're Baha'i in training. You're not Baha'i yet. Wink, wink, right? And so it's just sort of, this was sort of this larger understanding of what it meant to be Baha'i in Africa was very fluid than in the West, where they would say, this is how you have to be Baha'i. And so whenever I would give a talk in the US, Baha'is from everywhere just sort of show up and they say, that's not true. We have to follow this and this. And I'm like, well, my sources, this is not how things were doing. Palm wine wasn't considered alcoholic, right? I mean, so there was just a very different way of understanding how to practice the Baha'i faith, which is what I absolutely loved. And so for me, I want to keep emphasizing Pan-Africanist worldview, because for them, it's not about ideology or theory. It's actually about living it out. It's actually about moving somewhere and feeling like you are one. And then there's disappointments when your neighbor is saying, you're not one of us. So these fractures, Pan-African sort of viewpoints. And one thing I do want to add is that the spaces they're moving into are predominantly Muslim spaces. Kumasi, Lome. And so the communities that they're making these urban centers, their networks are people who are predominantly Muslim. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Tamo. Really, I can't thank you enough for complicating this context of resistance. And it made me remember Dr. Darrington's question about what new thing are you going to engage with in this scholarship. And you're asking this helped me to really, I wrote down, this is a new thing, literally to further complicate sexual violence. And it really is very complicated, especially to survivors or the victims themselves. And this is very personal for me because I'll tell you why. My late grandmother's sister was sexually assaulted severally. My grandmother, who was also just about 16 at the point, you know, during the colonial period, was also sexually assaulted. And I was privileged to hear my grandmother talk about this, you know, and for her, as you said, you know, surviving that experience was quite powerful, despite that she had to relive it many times. In fact, she would tell me in an interview that when the officer learned that the officer who, perpetrated those acts against her passed away in a mysterious way, she thought that her victory had been won. I have really a lot of accounts about this, and I'm really thinking about how am I going to refine this research to complicate, the subtle nuances of resistance beyond during the act, this person slapped a colonial officer or wrote a petition and all that. So it's really something I'm going to think deeply about, and as I said, it's going to form the theoretical and conceptual framework of the much larger project, which eventually I intend to be a book. Yeah, and for the question about Langston Hughes, yes, that's the same Langston Hughes, and it was right after the Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, which I believe ended in about 1937, 38-ish. Yeah. So Langston Hughes, I had a footnote about him a little bit, where this is from his autobiography, which is a volume 13. He talks about the Big C. And this volume traces his early years, his childhood, the challenges he faced as a literary icon who was trying to establish himself, in a predominantly white neighborhood, with his minority background. So he's well-traveled, by the way, or he was well-traveled. So in that autobiography, the section I focused on was particularly his accounts of Africa when he traveled. And I noticed that his accounts, of course, autobiographies have limitations, right? Personal biases and all of that. But I noticed that his accounts were very consistent with what I found at the archives. So I thought that they were trustworthy to incorporate, even both in terms of time frame and in terms of the larger narrative about sexual violence. So I used him, as one of those accounts to further make my point. So thank you so much.
Okay, I think that was it in terms of the questions, and I've been told we are starting again at 4, the next panel. So a good long break. Thank you to our panelists and for all your questions.